Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today's webinar. My name is Evren Tok, Assistant Dean of Innovation and Community Development, College of Islamic Studies, Hamad bin Khalifa University. Today, we are presenting Faith, Public Policy, and Gender Nexus in a post-COVID-19 world. The world will not be the same after the pandemic. In the midst of lockdowns and all the negative effects we have been experiencing, we believe that it's time to use COVID-19 as an opportunity to rethink our understanding of humanity. The nexus we investigate in this webinar between faith, public policy, and gender invites us to scrutinize COVID-19 from an intersectionality lens and better assess various forms of inequality which often operate together and exacerbate each other. The pandemic crisis does not operate in a vacuum, and as a result, it has been causing pre-existing inequalities to increase even further. The big picture is much more complex than the statistics released by governments every day. Pre-existing vulnerabilities are deepened, social and protective networks are disrupted. Many women are forced to stay at homes where they are not safe or secure. Our event attempts to draw attention on the urgent need to build a holistic development agenda that addresses intersectional injustices, including universal health coverage and gender-just health systems, equality in education, economic empowerment, and freedom from exploitation, violence, and discrimination. Religious communities and faith-based initiatives are trying to be integral parts of the whole at the policy tables. To reduce the need for in-person gatherings, religious leaders are coming up with innovative and creative options that have inspired their communities to accept and adapt to the reality, such as online observance, drive-through church services, and virtual baptisms and weddings. On the one hand, the pandemic may lay the groundwork for closer public service partnerships between local governments and faith communities in the future. On the other hand, we need to be sensitive to the rise of corona extremism and securitization agenda. So we would like to start with a little bit of housekeeping at the start. Please kindly acknowledge that all the mics are muted, and there is a small panel in WebEx where you can enter your questions. And here, when you are putting your questions down, please ensure that you choose all the panelists. We'll be collecting the questions, and after the presentations, there will be a Q&A period. Would you like to start with a really cool check-in activity? This activity is intending to create a connection between the audience and try to understand where we are right now in terms of like our perceptions of certain numbers and realities. So there are two ways to start this activity. Either you can log into paulev.com/Doha. This is the link that you can reach to the poll. And then the second option is you can just simply go to paulev.com, and as you can see, there is actually a username. You can just put Doha there and you join. And then afterwards, you'll be seeing your first question. So let's get started. Here is the first question. How do you feel today? Once you click on that, I can see on the screen actually, most of us are very happy, and a bit less happy, neutral, a little unhappy, and quite unhappy. It's good actually that most of us are feeling really good today. I will wait for 10 more seconds. There is definitely many of our colleagues actually are feeling quite good today. This is really good news. So it means that the vibe actually in our session is quite good. Thank you so much. Let's go to our next question. How many people were born today? Okay, now some answers. The 250K, 3.5 million, 70, 50, 10,000. The real number actually is that 250K, I think, is the closest. Today, as of now, I'm checking, there is the number of births today, just today, on 23rd of June, it's increasing every second, by the way, in the worldometer. I can see it is 257,000, or right now it's almost 258,000. So that is a gigantic number. Let's do another one. How many people died today? In the past, we wouldn't really think of these questions a lot, but every day we are getting numbers of number of people with infected with coronavirus, number of people recovered, number of people died. But in a day, how many people die in a regular day in the world? Let's get some numbers. 100K, 500,000, a million, 28,000, 300,000, 330. But according to Worldometer, as of now, there is 108,000 people died today since the beginning of the day. Okay, we'll actually change the gears a little bit. And here's some multiple choice questions. In the world, 2020, how many people with no access to a safe drinking water source? I can see 500 million is doing better than others, and 100 million, and then 800 million and 100 million are kind of following. And according to like statistics right now, like live statistics, actually the number is 800 million today in 2020, people with no access to a safe drinking water source. 800 million. So 30% of us actually answered the question correctly. Next one. In year 2020, so far, since January 1st, 2020, total number of abortions in the world. I see 10 million is the highest right now, but the answer is approximately 20 million, which is actually 27% of the audience actually made the answer. Total death by cancer as of today in 2020. Again, these numbers are all global. 1 million, 7 million, 4 million, and the correct answer here is 4 million. This is the one more than half of us actually got the right answer. This is one of the very interesting questions. Which public expenditure is highest in the world? In this question, the answer actually, you can do a ranking. Public healthcare, public education, and again, this is the world in general. So which one is the highest? Which one is the second? Which one is the third? So in reality, public healthcare expenditure globally in the world is the highest, followed by public education expenditure, and then afterwards, the third one is public military expenditure. But of course, here, a critical issue is by how much? What is the difference between them? If I were to give you the answers, total public expenditure for healthcare in the world in year 2020 is approximately, there's the two versions in today's world, $2.6 trillion. Whereas total public education expenditure in the world is $1.8 trillion. So public healthcare was $2.6 trillion. Public education expenditure is $1.8 trillion. And then finally, only $819 billion for public military, which is this graph is actually having the audience actually got the other healthcare and education rank right, but the military is number 3. So without further ado, we would like to actually shift to our presentations and and invite our esteemed panelists to the picture. We will first have Professor Leslie Powell. I'm just right now going over the schedule. Professor Powell, I will be doing a very short introduction, and before the presenter, my introduction will be slightly longer. We have Professor Leslie Powell, founding Dean of College of Public Policy, is the first speaker. Afterwards, we have Dr. Khadija El-Shayal, a postdoctoral research fellow at Al Walid Center for the Study of Islam in the Contemporary World, Edinburgh University. And then we have Ms. Sanam Naragi Anderlini, director of LSE Center for Women, Peace and Security, and founder and CEO of International Civil Society Action Network, ICANN, as the third speaker. And here, the idea here is to connect policy, faith, and gender, and rather than look into them as different, as independent areas and sectors, try to understand the nexus they create. And as you see in the brain, actually, there is this big picture, and the other ones are different, distinct pictures, different mechanics and processes, but how can we make sense of the nexus? So the schedule for today is, we'll start with Professor Powell with the pulse responses, and afterwards we'll have Dr. Khadija Chayal reflecting on faith communities, and third we'll have Ms. Sanam Anderlini bringing a gender lens, and afterwards we'll get into an exciting session of questions and answers. So our first speaker is Professor Leslie Powell, and Professor Leslie Powell is the founding dean of the College of Public Policy at Hamad bin Khalifa University, member of Qatar Foundation, and he's the author and editor of more than 30 books. And his recent books include Global Governance and Muslim Organizations, Policy Transfer, Microdynamics, and Macro Effects. And he has published over 90 articles and book chapters in a variety of different areas of public policy and administration. He has served as a consultant to many Canadian governmental and ministerial bodies and organizations. And he also served as a consultant to the World Bank before. Professor Leslie Powell, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Everin, and welcome to all of the participants and to the audience. My task is to talk about the policy responses and the quality of those responses to the pandemic. And I thought what I would do is, with 2 slides, just try to illustrate some of the complexities and some of the challenges in actually thinking through public policy in connection with the pandemic. So the next slide, Dr. Talk could move to the next slide, please. This is from the UN Economic and Social Committee on Western Asia. It provides a clock on COVID in the Arab region, and the numbers, of course, are distressingly high in terms of the number of deaths and the impacts in terms of cases overall. And I know that the print is a little bit small here for you to read, but it gives you a sense of the scope in one particular region. But what I'd like to draw your attention to is that, we see the usual metrics here in terms of trying to understand the impact of the pandemic. So we see the overall number of cases, the number of recoveries, and then tragically the number of deaths that occur in each country. And in looking at this, you get a sense of scale. You get a sense that the number of cases will be, typically related to population, but the relationship is not actually perfect. We have the case, for example, of Egypt, which has a population of 100 million people, and the number of cases there, all cases so far as of a couple of days ago, is 54,000. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia has 1/3 of the population of Egypt, but 3 times the number of cases. So the relationship between population and cases is not absolutely clear. And then when you look at Syria, the total number of cases allegedly in Syria is only about 187. So we have 3 different countries, and you've got a full scale of countries here, a full range. with very different populations, but also very different numbers of cases and impact of the pandemic. So we can't simply think about the impact of the pandemic in terms of population numbers. We have to think about other kinds of characteristics. So one of them is reporting. And the Syrian case, I think, illustrates some of the problems in terms of reporting cases. How well do governments actually report the number of cases they have? The testing regimes, how extensive are governments testing their populations with respect to the pandemic? Demographics makes a big difference. Countries with not just the number of population, but the configuration of the population. People with underlying conditions, for example, coronary disease or lung disease or other issues like that will have much, much higher rates of incidence of COVID and recovery rates than will otherwise healthy people. Density of populations also makes a difference, so that small countries with small populations like Qatar can have actually disproportionately high number of cases because of the density of the population. And that's true of New York as well. In the United States, overall, in New York, it accounts for one single city in one state accounts for 1/4 of all of the deaths in the United States. So in looking at these numbers and trying to get a sense of the incidence and the impact of the pandemic, you need to think about more than just population size. There are other kinds of characteristics and factors that have made a big difference in the way that the pandemic hits different countries. If we could move to the next slide, this is from will come up. This is from a very recent publication by The Economist Intelligence Unit, looking at and ranking and rating about 21 countries, OECD countries, in terms of their responses to the pandemic. And you'll see there that they've categorized countries in 4 classes as responding well, very good, well, poor, fair, good, and very good. And one of, there's some surprises that leap out from this. Maybe the most interesting one is that the US, the one at the very bottom of the list, comes out as good, 3.11 out of a possible score of 4. Other countries like Australia and Austria and New Zealand are ranked by the Economist unit as doing very well. So what lies behind this? What you'll notice is that they have measured this along 2 dimensions. They looked at the quality of the policy responses, and they've measured those in terms of the number of tests or the testing regime, the provision of non-COVID healthcare. In other words, how well has the healthcare system in a particular country responded in terms of having some additional resources or sufficient resources to be able to deal with people who have normal health issues outside of the pandemic. And then the actual death rate, which is less a policy response than it is an outcome of the response. But as I was saying before, you can't just look at policy responses. You have to look at the context within which those responses have been exercised. So the Economist balances the quality of those policy responses, for example, a very good or very poor testing regime, with respect to 3 dimensions of, or what they call risk factors. And again, they're just using indicators here: obesity prevalence, the share of the population over the age of 65, and the number of international arrivals. And then they balance the quality of the policy responses against these risk factors, and you get the somewhat surprising, in some cases, somewhat surprising results, where a country's response may have been middling, but if its risk factors were relatively low, it performs quite well. If the risk factors for a country like Italy, for example, were very high, even the best kind of policy response under those circumstances would face some difficulty. So on the right-hand side of the slide, I've touched on the quality of the response or risk factors. If you were thinking more broadly about policy responses, do they actually are they entirely captured by the 3 that the Economist has highlighted here: tests, the healthcare system for non-COVID issues, and the death rate? There's a lot more that governments have had to do, as we're all, I think, aware, in responding to the pandemic. And I just want to run through some of the other kinds of policy responses that governments have had to wrestle with. Workplace closures, the lockdowns, the definitions of what are essential services, the school and educational and institutional closures that took place as part of lockdowns. What have governments and what have those school systems and educational systems, how have they responded to the closures, been able to continue to deliver education, particularly for K to 12? The prohibitions that different governments around the world have placed on mass gatherings. And Dr. Talk mentioned religious gatherings, but there are also, as we've seen over the last weeks, protests as well, sporting events, and other kinds of gatherings, particularly in this part of the world around Ramadan. How have governments exercised policy initiatives to try to deal with mass gatherings? Movement, whether that's international travel or even internally to governments. There have had to be responses for special populations, prison populations, and perhaps even more importantly, seniors' homes and residences, and how have governments been able to manage, again, close quarters among very vulnerable populations. Economic policy measures, and this gets us more into the reopening component, because we're now in a different, most countries are in a different phase in terms of responding to the pandemic. The initial responses were primarily health-based, lockdown, educational and work institutions, and just trying to contain the pandemic. We're now moving into a policy phase for most governments of reopening, and that means measures of economic relief, which may have to deal with social protection measures, unemployment insurance, support for people in job searches, support for businesses, taxation measures, and a whole, even trade measures, and a whole host of economic responses, not to mention the social policy responses around food transfers in some instances, dealing with homelessness, and labor policies for low wage and informal workers. So when you look at the full suite of potential policy responses, especially as we move into the second phase, again, it becomes a much more complicated and complex set of responses that are required by governments. And coming up with a list as useful as this one is considerably more complicated. So for people in the audience, when you're thinking about your own government responses, try to think about both the responses in the first early stages in dealing with the pandemic, and now moving into the second and later stages, trying to address the ancillary challenges in the economic and the social context. And I'm sure we'll be hearing much more about those dimensions from our colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Powell, for this fabulous intervention. And our next speaker is going to be talking about faith communities and the perspective of faith to the Nexus. And Dr. Khadija Eshayal is our next speaker. And to give you a brief bio of Dr. Khadija Eshayal, she has recently completed her postdoctoral and teaching fellowships, actually, at University of Edinburgh, where she organized and taught on a number of courses in the School of Divinity, with a specialization in the contemporary history of Muslims in Britain. She received her PhD from Royal Holloway, University of London, and her research interests lie in the representation, political and cultural activism of Muslims and ethnic minorities in the UK. She is the author of Muslim Identity Politics, Islam, Activism and Equality in Britain, and Scottish Muslims in Numbers, Understanding Scotland's Muslims through 2011 Census. There, Dr. Khadija, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Dr. Talk, and thank you very much for having me at this really interesting gathering. It's really great to be with you guys. So I'm coming at this discussion from the perspective of my expertise on Muslim minority communities in Western contexts. And I just want to go through a few areas where the pandemic has had specific impacts on these communities and examine some examples of the kind of interactions that these Muslim communities have had with the issues that I'm highlighting, and draw out some salient analyses really around around these challenges in the short term and the long term, and perhaps we can explore some of these areas and their intersection with the other two themes of gender and public policy in the discussion that follows. So I'll start off by really reflecting on the public health aspect. Ever since the beginning of the pandemic, I think the monitoring of sort of demographics, really, of people who've been affected, it's been quite clear that minority ethnic populations have been much more highly impacted in terms of contracting the virus, but also death rates. And statistically speaking, Muslim communities make up a large proportion of minority ethnic communities in the West. And so, I mean, to take the British example, 1/3 of Black and Asian and minority ethnic communities are of the Muslim faith. And so they're much more highly represented in these statistics. And there are a number of factors, I think, if we try to unpack this and try to understand why there is this overrepresentation. Part of it is due to these populations constituting a greater proportion in the lowest socioeconomic bands in terms of their location and where they reside. They're concentrated in urban areas. A lot of that's to do with migration patterns and history of migration and community formation and settlement. And as Dr. Pal gestured in his presentation, densely populated urban areas are areas where we do have higher rates of transmission and obviously the impact and the unfortunate death rate is a lot higher. Additionally, in these urban areas, we've got a greater pressure on healthcare services, for instance, much more intense because, again, because of the higher population. Housing conditions are another factor that we need to think about. So among Muslim communities, again, with lower socioeconomic scores, you see a higher representation in social housing, for instance, which is more likely to be overcrowded, with more limited access to open space. So all of these are factors really that we need to think about as to understanding the specific public health impact of the pandemic in these Muslim populations. Moving on to sort of economic impacts. So economies have obviously been quite seriously hit by the pandemic, and again, among these populations, the Muslim populations in Western Europe, we see that there is a higher rate of precarious employment, partly due to people's transient status, but also due to higher rates of self-employment and small business ownership. There are lots of reasons why there is a higher representation in these bands, and one of them is barriers that people face actually in the professions and in getting into the professions and getting employed in sort of larger setups as employees. And so people turn to setting up their own smaller initiatives themselves so that they can run their own businesses, basically. Now, the issue with this obviously is that in terms of sort of a safety net or a sort of financial backup at times of crisis, it's that much harder. So government support schemes and furlough schemes have varied in different areas, but it just the onus being on somebody who's running a small enterprise on their own to make a case for their own support, and sometimes that isn't covered by the various allowances that are put out by governments, and so that's sort of an added stress, in particular if we're talking about fluctuating incomes, maybe the seasonal sort of types of work that people are engaged in, whether it's to do with sort of the sort of hospitality industry or whatever it is. And so there's greater susceptibility really to sort of being more harder hit economically. Also sort of within this bracket of economic activity, and I guess coming at it from with the perspective that I know best, which is in the UK, it's been quite noticeable the high rate of National Health Service staff who've been of a Muslim background, who have sadly who we've lost to COVID, and there's been a great sort of it's sort of impacted quite strongly on the debate around immigration and support for migrants, whether it's sufficient, and discussions around sort of rhetoric and sort of political wranglings around immigration and the place of migrants in our society as a result of that. So maybe that's something we can unpack in the discussion a little later down the line. Moving on to sort of practical implications within faith communities themselves. So the previous two speakers also alluded to the fact that religious observance and worship in terms of large gatherings have had to adapt to the pandemic and to the lockdown that has been implemented in various countries in various shapes and forms. I think with the nature of sort of Muslim communities, in particular, the nature of Muslim prayer, Muslim congregational prayer being so very sort of the close contact aspect being such a sort of central part to it. I think the impact of that, and in particular, again, with the coincidence with Ramadan, has been quite interesting because so much of Ramadan centers around community and communal sort of gatherings. So I think it has been interesting to really track how communities have sort of made that shift towards online presence, online gatherings. Another interesting aspect around this has been sort of examining how religious authority has really interacted with these new challenges. And so in particular in the internet age, you see religious scholars really taking into account, being forced to take into account that they don't give their directives or their opinions in a vacuum. They're not speaking specifically only to their congregation or to their constituents. Similarly with sort of Muslim representative organizations that liaise with the state, again, because the internet is the main medium now for communicating their positions, they have to take into account that they'll be interacting with people from unexpected spaces and that they'll be subject to scrutiny in ways that they previously weren't. And I think that's had quite an interesting impact on the kind of discourse that people engage in, and really sort of, in many ways, enriched the debate and discussion around authority and community in this moment. So yeah, I guess another aspect to highlight, and I think both of these I've got a couple of images if you look on the slide, around community organizations sort of communicating to people around messaging around safety, and how to think about sort of reopening their mosques, for instance, after the pandemic, after lockdown, but also another area being funerary practices and end-of-life rites. Again, with restrictions on numbers and distancing, it's been quite a challenge for, in particular, Muslim funeral practices, which tend to be quite ad hoc because of the sort of speedy turnover nature of the process, and also with the great emphasis that's placed on sort of maximizing numbers traditionally in funeral prayers and burial. And burials. So there's had to be a lot of change and restriction around that, and a lot of sort of quite clear but firm communication around that. I've also got an example of that here on the slide for you to have a look at. But there's also been anxiety and sort of people liaising with governments around the ideas that were mooted, for instance, around compulsory cremations due to issues around space because of the sheer sort of volume of burials that were having to take place. And so again, that's been an area for sort of sort of interaction between communities and policymakers. Now, all of this has really had some sort of quite interesting long-term changes that people are going to have to sort of really incorporate, as Dr. Tok mentioned in his introduction. You know, the world's changing sort of permanently in many ways, and people are going to have to sort of think about, and already are thinking about, sort of how to incorporate and take into account these changes. And so, for instance, from a finance perspective, again, Muslim institutions often rely very heavily on the income that they're able to garner during Ramadan, whether through fundraising drives. That's a time when a lot of people give their charity or their zakah, and with in-person gatherings not happening, that's had a knock-on impact on funding for institutions that are already quite stretched and that are already struggling. And there's that, and in addition to extra expenditure that is having to be factored in due to public health measures being implemented, hygiene, and various other sort of issues around security, for instance, social distancing, facilitating social distancing. All of these are extra expenses that need to be factored in. So there are a lot of questions being asked about sort of when community spaces and mosques are reopened, what's that going to look like? What social distancing going to look like in terms of sort of, is there going to be timetabling, or how there's only so much you can stretch physical spaces, and so how is that going to be negotiated? It's raised questions around women's access and inclusivity in these spaces as well. Are they going to be prioritized, or are they going to be pushed aside at moments like this? These are all sort of debates that are ongoing at the moment. People are coming to terms with. So I'll end up by just gesturing briefly to the securitization agenda. And so again, Dr. Tok mentioned the notion of COVID-19 extremism. This is something that a lot of security apparatuses in a number of Western states have been quite preoccupied with. There's a narrative of people being sort of stuck at home and therefore more susceptible to online recruitment, if they're vulnerable people, basically not interacting with other people and therefore becoming more susceptible to being taken advantage of by radical groups. There are also issues around surveillance and monitoring, which again, we've seen in dealing with COVID, a lot of states have made use of a number of applications to sort of monitor people's movements and get people to check in, and really sort of from a perspective of public health, but also is there a trade-off with that, and are we sort of giving up aspects of our privacy? Are we being monitored? Are we being surveyed? Is there an issue around that relating to communities that are already considered to be suspect communities? Again, I'm speaking particularly from the perspective of studying Muslim communities, which are already profiled and already targeted in many ways, quite unfairly, by securitization measures. So this is again an area of real anxiety, I guess. Even in the physical spaces, we've had police patrols that have been out in public spaces to make sure that people are distancing, to make sure breaking up gatherings and this kind of thing. There's been a lot of talk about profiling there. So are we sort of picking out people who people of color, people from different, conspicuously look different, and targeting them to sort of search them or break them up or break up their gatherings, and sort of turning a blind eye to sort of to other gatherings that sort of might not arouse our suspicions, or we might not profile in the same way. So yeah, I'll end there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, dear Dr. Khadija, for the wonderful talk. And it was really compelling. Thank you so much for this. Our next speaker, she'll be bringing us actually a gender-based lens, gender perspective. And we have Ms. Senem Naraji Anderlini, founder and CEO, International Civil Society Action Network, ICANN. She's also the director of Center for Women, Peace and Security at London School of Economics. Awarded an MBE in Her Majesty, the Queen's 2020 New Year's Honor List for her services to international peace building and women's rights. Senem Naraji Anderlini has over 2 decades of experience as a peace strategist working globally on conflicts, crisis, and violent extremism with a mix of civil society, governments, and the United Nations. At ICANN, she spearheads the Women's Alliance for Security Leadership, comprising independent, women-led organizations active in 40 countries globally, preventing violence and promoting peace, rights, and pluralism. She was appointed as director of LSE's Center for Women, Peace and Security in December 2019. Her current appointments include serving on the steering board of the UK's National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security, the Commonwealth's Panel of Experts on Countering Violent Extremism, UNDP's Civil Society Advisory Council, and adjunct professor at Columbia University. In 2014, she was the recipient of UN Association Perdita Houston Award for Human Rights and 2016 Greeley Peace Scholar at the University of Massachusetts. Ms. Sanam Narajandarlini, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's been fascinating to listen to my co-panelists. I wanted to bring a gender lens to the conversation and kind of look at the nexus between gender and faith in terms of COVID and the implications for public policy broadly, but also in the post-COVID world, as you mentioned. So what does it mean to bring a gender lens? In its most simplest form, it's basically looking at these problems and saying, how are men affected? How are women affected? And in the case of COVID, for example, what we see is that the vast majority of, in the initial stage of the disease globally, men were more likely to die than women were, but women were becoming more infected. More women were becoming infected than men. So from a physiological standpoint, there was already a difference. Women are the majority of healthcare workers globally, both in sort of medical arenas and hospitals and so forth, but also much at home. And one of the interesting things that's happening right now is as the pandemic has spread and we're getting data from other countries like India, there's a question now of, are more women dying because they are more impoverished and more exposed because of the care work that they're doing? Now, what does this mean in a very simple way in terms of public policy is that we have to think about it, that if you have families and communities where breadwinners, you have a traditional household, the man is the breadwinner of the family, and the men are dying, the implications for the widow and the children are huge, because that's going to have long-term implications in terms of livelihoods. If you're living in countries where the laws don't allow inheritance, what are the implications? What happens to that widow and her children? So that's one aspect of it. Similarly, if we have mothers dying, what does it mean if you have fathers left with their children and the uncertainty that arises in terms of just the family being broken apart? So these issues have broad public policy dimensions where you see the human lens of it and the diversity of issues around the human dimensions. Another aspect of this that we've seen is that the levels of violence against women and children have shot through the roof. Again, I work very much on issues of conflict and crisis, and unfortunately, this is a phenomenon that we see. So whether there's a tsunami, an earthquake, war, violent extremism, any type of space where you have a form of crisis happening, it's always layered with opportunistic violence against women and children, unfortunately. And this time around, we're seeing it heavily across the world. This is not a cultural phenomenon. It's happening in England and France and Italy as much as it is in China and India and across Iraq and other countries that we're seeing. We're seeing levels of incest going up because people are stuck at home, and unfortunately, this is kind of behavior that emerges. And it's important to understand, and again, from a public policy standpoint, long term, what does it mean? Why is it that when you have people cooped up together, women get as frustrated as men do, women can be just as angry about what's happening or just as depressed about issues, but what is it that allows men to give themselves the right to beat up on their women and their kids, right? So on their wives and their children. So it's a cultural issue, it's a societal issue, it's an economic issue, but it's also around how we bring up what it means to enable certain types of behavior between men and women. And I'm just putting these out there just so that we can have a conversation about it. My work specifically has been very much looking and working with women peace builders. This is a little poster with pictures of women from many of the countries that I work in. What we saw from the beginning of the pandemic, the minute it broke out, was that women peace builders in countries affected by war and conflict, so Syria, Iraq, Yemen, in Lebanon, in Cameroon, in Uganda, all these amazing pictures that you see, women peace builders became the first responders. And there's a particular reason why this happens. As peace builders, they're already working in their communities and bridging between government actors, local government, local police, and marginalized communities, families, maybe minority communities, maybe displaced communities. And they have the trust. And what they did was they became the first ones to go out there and raise awareness about hygiene, about washing your hands, and about sanitizers. In many of these places in Pakistan, in Yemen, elsewhere, where there were no hand sanitizers. In fact, a lot of our partners have been saying that one of the issues is that the WHO is telling people to go wash their hands with soap and water, but we're dealing with countries where people are saying we have neither soap nor water. What are we meant to do? And so these women at the local level are digging down and saying, how do you make soap? What are the ingredients? How do we make hand sanitizers and distribute them in places where there is no government service? In the case of Pakistan, one of our partners that works there, and there's in areas where they've had problems of violent extremism, and we've helped them develop a network of women who themselves had become involved in violent extremism and have now been de-radicalized and are involved in promoting pluralism and nonviolence. That network of women has been activated, and across the rooftops of their homes, they're sharing information about what to do with hand washing and what to do with sanitation and so forth, and also embedding it in cultural and religious texts and so forth. So if the Quran has teachings about that say, when there's the plague, you should not leave your house, you should not move, they're weaving that into their narrative and into their message to say the lockdown matters. It's our religious duty to not move around. It's our religious duty to also to wash our hands and things. So you see the combination of these factors, but as peace builders, they're really at the forefront of dealing with this. Once they started dealing with the health crisis, they also realized, of course, that there's a food crisis because people under lockdown, livelihoods are being affected. So they've become involved in the provision of food bags. And as my colleague was mentioning, Ramadan, one of the things that we've seen women in Afghanistan and, as they say, across Yemen and Syria and elsewhere, during Ramadan, they became the purveyors of pulling together local businesses, local organizations to actually provide food bags to the most desperate families. So again, this is what women peace builders are doing. One of my colleagues in Turkey, who was a Syrian refugee, was working with Syrian, the refugee community there, and they were approached by the host community, by Turkish families that were also having food insecurity issues. And she ended up being the point person or the bridge between the local authorities, the business community in terms of collecting money, the local grocery stores and others to provide food and enable this access to the host community families as well. So this is another thing that we're saying. As I said, how does this relate to faith and those dimensions of it? There are two things that we see. On the one hand, as I mentioned, our colleagues are able to draw on the best teachings of their faiths, and this can be, as I said, in countries where it's Muslim majority, but also elsewhere in terms of what does it mean to be a good Christian or a good Muslim in terms of helping each other. That's one aspect of it. Unfortunately, what we see across the board also, whether it's here in the United States where I'm living or across Muslim majority contexts in South Asia and in the Middle East and elsewhere, is that the extremist movements that were there, that have their roots in some of these places, are exploiting this pandemic for their own benefit. So what's happening is that in certain areas, whether it's through mosques or through their local networks, they're starting off by providing food. So again, they're addressing a local need and a desperate need that people have. But at the same time, they're layering it and saying, this plague has come because you've been bad Muslims. You have to join us. This is God's punishment for you. You have to join us in pushing back against this. They're criticizing the government for not being present. There are even messages on the ISIS notice boards and so forth on social media where they're targeting women to say, here's how you have to maintain hygiene and so forth, but also be wary of the messages from Western entities coming to us. So they're playing a very mixed game of trying to foster mistrust and division and actually recruiting people to their side through the provision of food. In Somalia, our colleagues were telling us that Al-Shabaab, the movement there, has been threatening religious leaders and telling them that if they actually speak out about COVID, they will be targeted. And then their message to the community has been that Muslims don't get this disease. This disease is for non-Muslims. And yet our local partners on the ground are saying the levels of illness and mortality are incredibly high. So we see people exploiting this, different movements exploiting this for their own benefits. Another dimensions of the faith issue is that it is really revealing the level of xenophobia and racism and just hatred that can be exploited. So in the case of Iran, for example, at the beginning, they were blaming Baha'is for this illness. In America right now, it's a lot of the sort of discourse and not just in America, but across again, other contexts, it's, oh, this is because of the Jews that this is happening. In places where we have smaller Muslim populations, it's the Muslims being blamed. So in India right now, the Hindu majority population is saying, oh, this is being spread by Muslims. So you see this division happening at a time when actually we need to be working together because it's a global pandemic and we need collaboration as opposed to division. And yet this is the xenophobia and the religion-based discrimination is profound. The third aspect of this is coming down to this question again. If I look at it from the standpoint of what does this mean for public policy, and if we bring a gender lens, and specifically if we think about it from a feminist standpoint, all of these issues raise fundamental questions about various forms of policy. So, for example, if economic policy, for 40 years we've been told that economic growth matters. Privatization will trickle down. People will get rich at the top, and this will trickle down. The benefits will trickle down to the bottom. And yet, when you look at the kind of countries that I deal with and around the world, and you see that people don't have access to clean water, as we heard earlier, people don't have access to healthcare infrastructure. That begs the question that that growth that was meant to benefit everybody, what has it actually done? Where are the services for people? Similarly, if you're doing development aid, and we've had 40 years of international development aid through the UN, through the World Bank, bilaterally and so forth, and yet we're dealing with places where they don't have the basics of healthcare and hygiene, where has that development aid gone? And it really reveals fundamental problems in the conceptual thinking of, as I say, economic growth and privatization is going to make it down to the ground and enable people to have access to resources. It doesn't. You need the government services there. We need to think about social services in a much more in a very different way, and we need to bring in it's not about communism and capitalism. It's really saying, ordinary people need access to clean water. They need healthcare. They need decent livelihoods. How do we bring this together, and how do we measure the success of our economic and fiscal policies based on delivery of those services? So that's a big paradigm shift. Similarly, I have a picture here of some pretty horrific security personnel that I saw on my streets. I was very close up and personal to them a few weeks ago. This was in Washington, D.C. These were heavily armed security personnel, militarized on the streets of D.C. with no name tags, with no identifying, except for this rather strange badge of the American flag with a skull on it. And what we're seeing again is that over these years we've spent billions, trillions of dollars on national security, but national security defined as military security. And yet, when it comes to the moment of deep national insecurity in America, in the UK, around the world, that security infrastructure that we've created, that militarized security infrastructure and securitized police that we've created, is actually incapable and should not be the response mechanism. What we need to do is to open up the discussions around what does security mean, and this is comes very much from the lens of women and feminist discourse, and say, well, security also means security in the home, security in our streets, so water security, food security. We need to shift the balance of where we put money in terms of weapons and militarization and war, and shift it towards peace and development and these other forms of human security, essentially. So that's another huge issue that I think has implications for public policy. The third thing is, as I mentioned, women peace builders are really active on the ground at the forefront of doing all this work, and yet they are civil society as a sector is being heavily repressed. It was being heavily repressed in the name of countering violent extremism before. It's under attack right now. And yet what they've proven is that when you have crises of any form, in any society, you need a mix of different sectors working together. You need the local government, you need civil society actors, women's organizations, youth organizations, the religious community. You need them all to come together because they have access and ability and agility in a different way. And it's the social fabric of our societies. That issue needs to be put front and center of public policy as well, because if we think of civil society as being anti-government, as opposed to recognizing that where there's dissent or criticism, it's actually for better governance. These are the citizens that really care about the well-being of our societies. It changes the paradigm. We need to shift and create a space where independent civil society is valued, it is resourced, it is enabled, it's brought to the table, they have access to people and places, and they fundamentally care about people that are often left behind, the most marginalized people in our communities. So that shift in thinking is also really critical in terms of moving ahead in terms of public policy. The importance of community structures, the diversity of actors at the community level. And then finally, I want to end with one note that we are now living probably in the most difficult era in the last 100 years. This is a period of economic uncertainty, pandemic, war and violence, authoritarianism is on the rise, and our multilateral we need so badly to be able to coordinate and collaborate and design and be comprehensive and holistic in our approaches. It's falling apart. We have a lack of moral leadership at the international level. The UN's permanent members, Security Council members, have lost their direction because of the number of wars and violence that they're implicated in it. And yet we need collaboration at that multilateral level. And this, to me, is the moment where smaller states, states that don't have a history and legacy of violence or colonialism, but have an interest and benefit also from multilateralism, need to come together. So whether it's Qatar and Norway and Canada and New Zealand and other countries, it really is a time to come together and think about a vision that's collective and collaborative moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much Ms. Sanam. And it was so great actually that you were able to kind of like, after the first and second presentations, the third presentation was really kind of helping us digest and kind of and go over all different aspects, and you also summarized them so well and articulated. Thank you so much for being with us. Their colleagues, their audience, their esteemed guests. Now it is the time for question and answer. And during the presentations, you have shared with us some questions, and now I will seek my colleagues' support to reflect the questions on the screen, and afterwards I will be reading them, and then we'll be giving actually 2 or 3 minutes to each speaker, each of our esteemed panelists to respond to the questions that they believe they are feeling more comfortable with. The first question is, when it comes to choosing between saving the number of people from death or economy in fragile economic countries, from your opinion, which one comes first? On one slide, people's lives are profoundly precious, but at the same time, if the national economy is sinking, the healthcare fund will be a burden on the other side. This is one of the questions. I wonder if we do this question by question, maybe it might be a better idea. Professor Powell, Professor Khadija, Professor Sanam, Please, if any of you want to, we can do this a bit more open session actually. If any of you would like to reflect on this question.
Well, I can say something, I guess. You know, it's not that stark a trade-off, because obviously, even if you're trying to deal with the impact of the pandemic and trying to save people from dying from the pandemic, and devoting all of your healthcare resources to that particular issue, we've all heard about the collateral damage that can occur as well when people who don't have the pandemic but have other health issues are affected, and then the impact of the lockdown. We heard from Sananam about the impact, and also from Khadija about the impact on mental health, on well-being, on situations and circumstances at home. So I don't think it's that kind of a stark trade-off. It has to be some kind of a balance. And then secondly, I think right now most governments, at least in the developed world, the OECD kind of group of countries, are probably shifting from a kind of COVID-focused response to dealing with reopening in the economy. So it's not a matter of opinion so much as which comes first, but it's a matter of reality. I think most governments are prepared now to alter the risk balance in favor of incurring some liabilities in terms of the health burden in favor of trying to open economies more. And that, you know, we've seen that, the impacts in terms of second waves, spikes. The WHO came out yesterday and today mentioning that there has been an increase in cases all around the world, and some of that, not all of it, but some of that is connected to reopening, and it's inevitable. So I think the reality is that we're going to see some greater numbers of impact from the pandemic as a consequence of reopening economies.
Just to add to that, I think we have to think of kind of, you have a moment where if we take a health analogy, of course, it's almost like, you know, you have an emergency room situation right now, right? We're trying to stop the number of infections and care for those who get infected so that they don't die. At the same time, we really need to prevent the spread of it, right? And the issue that that certainly in the United States we're dealing with right now is that unfortunately the entire discussion has become politicized. So whereas the WHO tells us and all the medics tell us, look, wear a mask, it makes a difference because you don't spread it if you have it. In this country, it's now become politicized. So if you're wearing a mask, it basically it means that you're a Democrat and not a Republican. It's become so there's an issue of government responsibility in terms of really messaging carefully and allowing people the options of how you go about doing this. If we lock everybody, you know, certainly here, if you locked everybody down, it wouldn't work. There are too many weapons around. People have too much, you know, discourse around their freedoms and so forth. And we don't necessarily need to do that. But there is an issue of state responsibility and how it conveys its message to us, and then citizen responsibility. What do we do for ourselves? What do we do for each other? How do we kind of behave in ways that allow that focus on trying to get a reduction in the spread of the disease? And as unfortunately, I can tell you that, you know, the latest here in the United States is absolutely horrific in terms of how things are spreading in now 23 states. So it's a governance question more than just an economics or a health questions, I think.
Dr. Khadija, did you have anything to add, or shall we move to the next question?
Just a quick one, actually, just to pick up on what Sanam was saying around messaging. I think from governments, I think I actually agree. It's not really. I mean, it's a question of dealing with reality and where we're heading. And most countries, as we can see, are sort of easing their lockdowns and looking towards sort of the future, as it were. But I think it's also important when we think about messaging that's coming out that in going through this sort of easing process, how encouraging people to go back to work, for instance, where are we centering or not, or sort of whether we're centering or not the position of vulnerable people in our societies. And so there's a lot of emphasis from governments about, you know, it's important to go back to work and support the economy. Often the people that are caught up in this or who suffer most in drives such as this are people sort of in the very sort of more more menial jobs, for instance, people working in public transport. There was a number of stories in cities around the UK where we had large numbers of bus drivers, for instance, who unfortunately contracted and passed away from COVID, partly because they just weren't, it wasn't the policy for the public transport companies to give them adequate PPE. Similarly, there's a lot of scandals worldwide around sort of nursing staff not being taken care of adequately in terms of their safety. And I think there is a dangerous, with waves of populism around, in particular in Europe, but again, actually worldwide, there is a lot of, we do have to be attuned to the kind of rhetoric and messaging that's coming out around sort of supporting the economy and how that can be taken advantage of or can be used to sort of bolster more nativist or more exclusionary narratives. So that's just what I wanted to flag up when we were considering messaging.
Just to add one last point to that. Here in the United States, Barbara Lee, one of the elected representatives, has proposed a bill to cut the Pentagon's budget by $350 billion and put it towards the economy, right, towards healthcare and livelihoods and so forth. And these are the kinds of conversations we need to have. Now, obviously, if you're a weapons manufacturer, you're not going to like that. And weapons manufacturers have huge lobbies in these countries. So these are the kinds of discussions that are we need to have around vested interests, who has access to political decision making, and what is really in the interest of the country and the broader public. But it's a moment of opportunity, but it's also, in a crisis, we always have opportunity, but we also have to be very careful of the opportunists who are in there already and trying to sort of set the stage to their own benefit. And having something like a cutback in the military expenditure is it's critical right now, and it's something that the public needs to know about and should be part of the discussion of nationally and globally. Thank you.
Thank you, dear panelists. This was really great. Dear colleagues, can we please move to the next question, if you can? I face this kind of policy in Indonesia right now. The government stopped the lockdowns for the sake of the economy. Our currency once fell over to the number that we never face, and also to save the millions of jobs to keep running. Then after the lockdown stopped, the number of positive COVID-19 drastically increased. From Professor Pell's opinion, what kind of trigger that made the government take this policy?
Well, if I understand the question, what is it that makes governments move away from the lockdown? In almost all cases, particularly in developing countries, the issue is the number of jobs and the economy. So governments are willing to take the risk in those instances to relax the restrictions, and then depending on what the ancillary or the supportive policies are. And again, this is part of what my colleagues were saying. What kind of messaging is there? What sorts of public health measures are in place in terms of masks, social distancing, having some kind of monitoring or IT. Again, it depends on the country. In Indonesia, I don't know what the circumstances are. So it's not just a matter of relaxing and removing. It's also a matter of what kinds of subsequent support the governments try to implement in terms of trying to contain the spread of the pandemic as much as possible, even in relaxed circumstances. And again, that takes an enormous amount of effort. And as my colleague said, often that will require a host of non-governmental institutions to help support that: religious organizations, community-based groups, volunteers, and it becomes a societal effort and not just a matter of what the government's doing and what the economy is about.
Thank you, Professor Pell. There, Khadija, can you please expand on Islamophobia and Corona extremism a bit more, and how it might affect other countries like the USA and other countries in Europe other than UK?
Yeah, so I think there's different levels. I mean, when it comes to Islamophobia, I think there's different levels that we can look at it from. So I think especially at the beginning of the outbreak, there was a lot of xenophobia and racism in sort of popular discussion around the nature of the disease. And so in particular, obviously against people from China because of where the outbreak first began. And so, but I think often that is conflated just with the ideas of foreignness and people being sort of seen and viewed as different and othered, really. And so on an everyday level, there is definitely a sense that if you a lot of sort of, and again, this is something that's amplified by the tabloid press, for instance, or by internet discussion forums, where analysis of how communities that are othered or minority communities engage with COVID. And so things like commentary around, oh, Ramadan is coming, are people are Muslims going to be breaking the lockdown because of a lot of sort of tropes that are popularized around, or which are accurate to some extent maybe, but are also quite stereotypical around the sort of the nature of Muslim communities. And so for instance, they gather in, they live in extended families, or they things like Muslims eat from the same dish in their family meals, for instance, and so they won't be distancing, and the rate of infection will be larger. Issues around sort of people, as I say, breaking the lockdown to observe aspects of Ramadan or Eid when that was coming up. There was a lot of sort of quite interesting reaction, in particular in the UK, to, but I think this was mirrored across the Atlantic, to some social media interventions from celebrities, Muslim celebrities or influencers, if you want to call them that, who I think there was about 2 or 3 instances where people got together and made videos to encourage people to stay at home that were directed specifically at Muslim communities. And often these were with the backing of political parties or government agencies. And people took quite strong affront to that, because it was seemed to be premised on the assumption that these people weren't good citizens, that Muslims weren't good citizens, and that they wouldn't be observing the lockdown on their own. They need to be told that this is the right thing to do, or they need to be convinced of it, whereas other citizens don't need this kind of special focus or special treatment. And so if you view this in the context of a wider scenario, again, if we view it in the context of sort of messaging that's coming from the government, so here and again in other European states, we had a lot of messaging around how tackling coronavirus was a sort of like a war effort. A lot of invocation of World War II spirit. Personalities like Winston Churchill being channeled, the idea of sort of an empire, or harking back to sort of a Great Britain that's going to sort of defeat this threat in battle. If you sort of put all these pieces of a puzzle together in the context of the populist politics we're living through at the moment, it's very much interpreted by many within Muslim communities as something that is exclusionary, that doesn't take them into account, that sort of pushes them aside, and they're not seen as being part of this. And this is aside from sort of a very more practical element that we need to think about in terms of Islamophobia being on the rise in general, and with for instance, buildings institutions being not being staffed, or people not being around to sort of look after the security, they're just that much more vulnerable. That's another element. So it's quite a complicated picture, but it's definitely a pressing concern at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Khadija. So I have a kind request from the panelists. We are having like an overload of questions, which is so nice, because it means that the audience is really engaged and they want to ask so many questions. So if you can, please, for each question, if one of our panelists just respond very concisely based on your expertise, I think this way we can cover and we can respond to more questions. So, and if you please can kindly keep the answers relatively shorter, I think this way we can maximize the number of answers. So this question comes to Ms. Salam. How would you ensure that your renewed definition of civil society is inclusive and non-Western? Aside from civil society being a volunteer association of individuals, would you attribute any other qualities to it? You are muted.
Thank you very much. So first of all, in the 25 years that I've been in this field, I have always worked with non-Western civil society organizations, and this is one of the things that we need to acknowledge. That when I say I'm working with Kenyans or Somalis or Iraqis or Syrians, I'm talking about local actors, local people, local women very often, who basically have understood, have been in the midst of a crisis that's emerged in their community and have decided to engage and solve the problem, not run away from it. They are very special people. I'm very privileged and humbled to have a community of colleagues around the world who are just extraordinary in terms of their depth of humanity and compassion and care. And one of the things that I would love is for more people to know that this exists, because they're so inspirational. These are, and I'll give you an example of what is the common thread amongst them. You take a conflict like Syria or Yemen, and it's presented to us as a football game of government and opposition groups. And yet when you look at it, both sides are killing people, bombing people, not enabling them access to food or hygiene or whatever. Those two entities cannot logically be recognized as representing the needs of their communities. What we see on the ground is that it's local actors, it's local peace builders who are the ones who are actually caring about their communities and caring about the kids and caring about the disabled and caring about making sure that people and food and so forth is, and mediating ceasefires, mediating access to relief. So there is a vast, vast world of non-Western organizations. And one of the issues that right now we have, from ICANN standpoint, we're advocating and we're working on, is to make sure that Western organizations that come and work in the field of development or peace building in various countries around the world in conflict areas, who use local organizations, are being asked to be accountable to themselves. Because so often what's happening is that either it's a big multilateral entity or a big international NGO comes along and lands in Syria, Yemen, wherever you may want. They can't do anything on their own. They need the local actors. They need the local organizations. But what they're doing is that they're either hiring staff into their own entities and not really helping to build up local organizations, or they contract out to local organizations and don't give them the credit for doing the work and for their expertise and for their knowledge. So that shift in the relationship has to happen. But there is a world of amazing, amazing, inspirational people and organizations out there in non-Western, quote unquote, countries. How do we identify what do we call it? There are lots of different definitions for civil society, but the way that I see it, I'm an anthropologist, and Ernest Gellner, who was a big anthropologist many years ago, defined this. And he said, think about it in terms of you have the state, and then you have, let's say, your family or your tribal or affiliations. Civil society is really that in-between space where I may be Muslim and I may be from this clan or that family, but I'm also interested in medicine, or I'm also interested in the environment. I come together and it becomes these associations where people from different, maybe political or ethnic or racial, or as I say, more traditional contexts of identity, come together based on areas of interest, based on values, based on what they care about. And they're working together for the betterment of their society. That to me is how we should be thinking about civil society. Does it criticize government? Yes, of course it does. I can't sit here and say I believe in peace and not criticize the United States government for what it's doing in supporting the Yemen war, or what it's doing in terms of militarization of police and the Black communities in this country. But that's where I'm not doing it to topple the government. I'm doing it to improve governance and reassert universal values of humanity, the universality of our human rights and the universality of having democratic pluralistic societies, which is basically the direction that we need to get moved to. So civil society is there. And one last point, where governments crush the civil society that is open and out and publicly available, when you crush that, you actually reduce the space for people to engage. So young people, if they don't have a place to come and address things that they care about, and all that happens is it goes underground, then what you see is the more radicalized, more angry, and often more violent forms that emerge. So having the space for a diversity of voices to engage in a constructive way is a much more effective way for governance than trying to crush it and pretend that the problems don't exist.
Thank you so much there, Ms. Sanam, for this amazing answer. Our next question is, it seems rapidly responsive policy making is crucial to managing the pandemic. Countries like New Zealand have set great standards while others are slow on the uptake. What have been the key features to enable such responsive policy formation? I assume this question would go to Professor Powell.
That's a really difficult question because of the issues that I was raising in my remarks about the number of factors that go into success. But given a certain demographic, well, to back up, how to early response. I mean, New Zealand and other countries, Hong Kong is another case with an extraordinarily small number of cases. Early and rapid response as soon as there was any evidence of the pandemic. Rapid response in terms of testing and trying to ensure that there was a clear sense of how many people were infected. A rapid response in terms of not necessarily lockdown. There's some debate in the literature. I mean, obviously it's still early days, but there's some debate about the full efficacy of a full lockdown in comparison to more targeted approaches. But the social distancing provisions and trying to enforce those as best as possible. Those seem to be the key ingredients. And having, again, you had to be lucky to a certain extent. You had to have a reasonably robust healthcare system that could respond to a sudden shock and a sudden spike. You had to have equipment. You had to have the testing equipment. You had to have the PPEs. So there were a number of ingredients that came together in most cases for richer countries that were better endowed. And in the case, again, of smaller countries, there seems to be some relationship between size and the rapidity and the efficacy of the response. Not perfect, but there's something there. So these were ingredients that came into the mix, and again, the demographics, the density of populations, all of those pre-exist and the pre-existing health situation of the populations as well mattered. So you had a number of external factors and risk factors as well as the response factors that came together that made it possible in some cases like New Zealand and others to respond much more quickly and effectively.
Dr. Tok, can I just add a couple of 3 points to that? So one of the things, amongst the things that we saw was countries that heeded the warnings early enough. You know, I was in England when we were already seeing the images from China, and in Britain, people were making fun of it. It was like, oh, the Chinese are crazy. So the question, and in the States, the warnings were given, the government didn't respond. So heeding the warnings. Pandemic preparedness. In the UK, they used to do pandemic preparedness. They used to have stockpiles of materials, but after the financial crisis, and especially after Brexit, they stopped that. So the government actually didn't, the healthcare system was not prepared for what to do if a pandemic comes, and the stockpile of materials was limited and it was out of date. And again, if you compare it to we have stockpiles of weapons galore, and yet we didn't have stockpiles of healthcare materials. And the third thing, which is really important, is in many of these, New Zealand, Norway, Denmark, in countries like that, Germany, people trust their leadership. So when the government says, this is serious, you need to stay at home, people believed it and trusted it. And that's about good governance having had good policies along the way. In places where you don't trust the government, in the past, the government has been predatory or has not been present. Now, all of a sudden, they tell you, hey, go stay at home. People don't. Why should they do that? They don't trust it. So these two things are really interlinked, and it's something that, again, from a longer term post-COVID question, needs to be brought into the public policy question of the social contract with a social and a society-state social contract.
Thank you so much. Great addition. And now we are almost in the last 3 minutes of our session. So before we conclude, can I please kindly ask our panelists to give their 45-second final thoughts, actually. Shall we start with Dr. Khadija?
Sorry. Okay. Sorry. You can hear me, right?
Yes.
Great. Yes. No, I mean, I think it's this is a situation that I think is unprecedented in many ways in modern times, at least, and it's rapidly changing, rapidly developing. Even sort of week by week, day by day, and I think there are a lot of lessons that we're learning here about how states function, their relationships with the communities that they serve and their constituents, and how societies, sort of people within societies and communities within societies relate to one another. And I think, it's almost become cliche, talk of this sort of new normal about how things are going to change forever. But I think we're at risk of sort of becoming even complacent to that and not really being constantly alert and constantly awake to the most vulnerable people in our societies and their needs. And I think that's one thing that I want to highlight in sort of moving forward, whether it's within our communities, whether it's within faith communities, whether it's within sort of public policy planning within the states, and obviously the gender issue that Sanam talked about so ably. I think if we can't have that sort of compassion and prioritizing and centering of people who are at most at risk, then I think we would have really missed a massive opportunity to sort of reconfigure a lot of the problems and challenges that have weighed us down over recent times in this moment.
Thank you, Dr. Khadija. Dr. Pal? We can hear you.
One observation and one question. The observation is that I think the governing models, the policy models that we've had in at least in the West, are under severe challenges as a result of the pandemic, and we're likely to see much more extensive, vigorous, muscular, interventionist governments, active governments than we've seen before by force of circumstance. So the kind of modeling or models of relatively light-handed governance that we've had, at least as a standard or a benchmark in the West, I think are going to be eclipsed as a result of the pandemic. And my question is, and it's something I don't think really addressed head on, is what kind, but it picks up on the point that Sanam made about trust as a factor that provided some countries with a capacity to respond better to the pandemic. I'm wondering if faith makes a difference or has made a difference. It's something that we may need to examine going forward and looking back. But I'm wondering to what extent, given that the pandemic has created a lot of social stress, a lot of mental stress, a lot of anxieties among people, I wonder whether faith communities had some resources and some resilience that might have provided some supports for those communities in ways that others did not. But that's a question, it's not a conclusion.
Thank you so much, Professor Pell. There, Dr. Sanam, please.
Thank you. As I said, I think that we are facing unprecedented times, and we need, as a global community, but also at a very localized level, to take this as an opportunity to say, how do we want to reshape and how do we want to adjust and renovate the international peace and security architecture that we've had, or the international economic and governance structures that we have, both globally but also nationally. So these are big questions. I would like us to end with, to always think about the humanity at the center of it. And I would put human rights, what is it that as individual human beings, we all should have a right to, based on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that we have. And at the same time, to think about security from the standpoint of human security. And how these two interlink, and what is it that our governments and our states should be thinking about and providing? Because it's not about a lack of resources, right? We spent money on weapons, we didn't spend it on healthcare. We spent money giving billionaires, gazillion dollar billionaires, and then we have poor people who don't have money. We have masses of corruption in various countries. So it's not that we don't have the resources, it's that we haven't been accountable enough and we haven't been transparent enough. And frankly, at the core of it is we're not tapping into and listening to and elevating the people who care, who are actually the most caring and compassionate and are, as I said, solving the problem as opposed to pretending that it's got nothing to do with them or benefiting from it personally. If I could shift everything around, I'd say identify those who are caring and who have responded and who have been consistent in caring, and let's put them at the helm of envisioning the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sanam. To all our panelists, it was such an honor to host you, and I really would like to thank to each of you for your amazing support and amazing contribution. Their attendees, their audience, thanks for showing interest to our event. You have seen the event in different sources probably, and you registered, you became part of it. But at the same time, there were some of us actually attending this event was like a must. Though I'm referring to the students of the amazing design post-COVID normal summer schools, which is organized by Nobox Lab, SOG Lab, and UNDP office in Beirut, as well as Islamic Cooperation Youth Forum, hosted by Hamad bin Khalifa University. What we have been doing as part of this design school was using human-centered design to reflect and to shed light on the post-COVID-19 world and normal. And now, as Sanam mentioned, we have to put humanity at the center. So we need to start thinking of designing post-COVID humanity and what the youth and all different stakeholders can do for it. So for everyone who became part of this event, special thanks to Hamad bin Khalifa University, member of Qatar Foundation, for hosting it. It has been such an honor and pleasure for all of us. Thank you so much. I wish you a pleasant day.